Dr. Miller, and maybe it's for you, Dr. Mercado. But the question is, well, first of all, I had a documentary film that I had the Department of Criminal Justice Services prepare and produce that's now available generally for parents in public libraries and throughout the state about who the sexual abusers are in order to help protect parents. So my question is, we're talking a great deal about the victimization of children. What about the parents who very often trust the person who's the abuser? We're assuming that it's not the parent, but it's the scoutmaster or the pastor or the uncle or somebody else in the family who abuses the child. And very often the parent will believe the person and not the child, the abuser and not the child. And I'm wondering about whether anybody has really considered the toll on the individual parents or the guilt, because some of them have to really be ridden with guilt as a consequence of allowing their children to be abused. So maybe somebody could address that. It's a long question.
I'm not aware of any research that has directly addressed that question. I think it's a very interesting question. But I think it's clear that in the changing fabric of society and in a changing social milieu, that parents have, as we see now, particularly with the church scandal unfolding, that even very trusted leaders in the community can commit these sorts of acts, that there has been a changing sense, a changing milieu in which parents are more likely to trust, to believe that these sorts of things can occur.
And certainly when you talk to people, you get this anecdotally. You see, and it's even more true when it's the husband abusing the child. And mothers sometimes turn the other way. And what that means is that child has no parents to trust, no parents to relate to. And 20 years later, that child still has no parents. That because mom went with dad. And it increases the damage for the kid because they finally got the courage to speak up. And mom and dad didn't believe them. And yeah, you're right. Mom and dad later, if it comes out that this was true, are going to have a huge burden of guilt. There's divorces that stem from that. There's other problems that stem from that. We do not have good measurement of that.
I would just add, Assemblyman Lentol, that one case where I was consulted, the father was a police officer, and his guilt was enormous because he said, I didn't even protect my own daughter. You know, there was an uncovering of one of these situations. And so just as a practical matter, I don't have the expertise of the witnesses on my left and right, but I've personally seen it. The guilt can be horrendous. This was a police officer. I didn't even protect my own daughter.
I mean, I know that this is a difficult subject for a lot of parents because of the guilt, but it just strikes me that this is the unspoken real consequence of this act that nobody really deals with.
I think it's very good that you bring it up. I think obviously it's a part of the tremendous pain being caused. And I keep thinking back to what Assemblyman Montesano asked about, whether these claims are going to be proven. There are claims of false sexual abuse. And I myself had an 11-month trial in Nassau County where it represented a bus company where the driver was accused and had actually pled guilty to abusing kindergarten children. And it turned out he had really abused Boy Scouts, but but the police went crazy, the parents went crazy, and it was a false claim. It didn't happen. And even though he had pled guilty, the jury found, and I think properly so, that he hadn't abused these children, which gets to your point. There's a protective device there. Those jurors were willing to listen to that, even though he pled guilty. And I do think it was a correct verdict after an 11-month trial.
But isn't that a very small percentage of claims? That's for what
I
I've
would think
read.
so, but
Minuscule amount of false
I would think
claims.
so. I would think so. It can be a weapon in these domestic disputes. What he did to our daughter, you know what I mean? And it's really being used as a false weapon. But the point I wanted to make is our system is very good at, I think, at detecting these false claims. We're hep to it, so to speak, and that's what I wanted to answer to it. Okay.
In other words, jurors do their job. And
Well, they
take
did the
it-
job in this particular case of mine. People said, "How did you do that? That must have been a miracle." I said, "Well, I went with the truth. That's a miracle, you know."
Uh,
Go ahead, Marge.
Okay. Dr. Miller, you estimate that childhood sexual abuse cost New York State $1 billion. Can you please tell us how you calculated that figure?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of different factors in there. Let me start out with the pain, suffering, loss, quality of life. The way we do that is we looked at more than 1,000 jury verdicts related to sexual assault, and we looked at the non-economic component of the damages. Now, there's actually another study that one of my co-authors, Mark Cohen, has done, where he's also gone out on survey and talked to people about how much they pay to keep sexual offenders behind bars so they can't reoffend. And he actually found that, if anything, our numbers might be too low on that portion of it. The medical costs, we really track them through the medical system. The mental health care costs, we went out with a survey to, I can't remember whether it was 400 or 1,000, it was probably 400 mental health care providers, asking them about what portion of their caseload were there because the underlying reason being a crime and what that crime was. And we estimated from that what proportion of sexual assault victims wound up in therapy, and it was generally years later, was what we learned from that survey. They were given the choice of was it soon after or many years later, and it was generally many years later. The National Crime Victimization Survey actually tells you about work loss following different crimes by the victim, and so we used that. We looked at the physical injuries that sometimes follow from sexual assault and costed those. I do a lot of work on the costs of injuries. I told you about the twin studies that we used to find out how often things like substance abuse occur. Another one of my areas is work on the costs of substance abuse, so I know how to cost that, and work on the costs of suicidal acts, so I knew how to cost that. We actually modeled the STV prevalence among sexual offenders, transmission rates by STD, used data from the Centers for Disease Control on the costs of different sexually transmitted diseases. We looked at the likelihood of pregnancy from a sexual assault, and a major factor there is how many of them are old enough to get pregnant. And I made a decision that where I stopped that portion of the costs was, here's the cost of the live birth, and that many of those children may be given up for adoption or something and become a wanted child somewhere. So I didn't want to cast any judgment on those child's lives, so I didn't.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, one last question.
Go ahead, sure.
Dr. Mercado, in closing, you suggest that the official counts of abuse underestimate the true prevalence of this abuse. Can you explain what the true figures might be?
Well, it's of course impossible to establish the ground truth for how many accounts of abuse there actually are, which we don't know about. But it's clear that in research that has attempted to address this question or has looked at in confidential or anonymous surveys, that as many as 25 to 40% of adults do acknowledge some sort of abuse that they never reported during childhood.
25 to 40%?
Right. Uh-huh.
Now, that's not
Or
just sexual abuse. That's sexual or physical abuse.
Right, that's correct.
It's all abuse.
Uh-huh.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate
Could
your
I
testimony.
add one thing? As I was listening to your questions, it occurs to me that maybe the way you address some of these concerns about, oh my God, it could cost our institution so much, might be to say that as we extend the statute of limitations, we place some cap on damages in the extended period. We either say no punitive damages in the extended period, or a maximum of this amount for damages, or no non-economic damages in that period. And that might be a way to still let these people get justice, to let them have a safe place where people can face these people and get them off the streets without breaking the bank.
I would oppose Dr. Miller's suggestion in that regard, as the one that will have to represent those victims. It's hard enough to get into court. Now you want to cap us before we even get there? Give me a break.
Thank you for your comment.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Our next panel is Eric Rosenbaum, who's the unit chief of the DNA unit of the Queens District Attorney Special Victims Bureau, and Lucinda Suarez, deputy chief, Queens District Attorney Special Victims Bureau. Morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thank you very much on behalf of Queens District Attorney Richard Brown for the opportunity to speak with you today about the costs of child sexual abuse. What I'd like to do, if I may, is focus my testimony before you on the less obvious costs of such abuse and of these cases. Because when thinking about these costs, what most people immediately think of is a crime is reported, the police respond, a prosecution may ensue, and isn't that the cost of child sexual abuse? Of course, many of us know that that's the tip of an iceberg. The full cost of child sexual abuse is complicated, and the number and range of police agencies alone can be overwhelming, let alone all the other resources that are devoted to it. An illustrative case is that of a 12-year-old girl in Queens that I handled not so long ago. She was raped on her way to school, a vicious attack. She was beaten as well. She appeared home. Within minutes of the attack, her father called 911. Within a very short time, patrol officers swarmed the entire area. The local detective squad responded to the scene. The Queens Special Victims Squad responded. Aviation was released. The K-9 unit was dispatched. Sketch artists worked on this. This is just the police department for a single case. Other agencies came. EMTs had to respond. She was removed by ambulance to the hospital. Forensic assault examiners collected evidence from her body. Physicians treated her injuries. Counselors were assigned to her. And as time went on, her parents' marriage became strained over this. As was touched on during the last panel of witnesses, this can affect a family. Long-term counseling was necessary. By the time that this offender was caught through DNA collected on an attempted larceny charge, years had passed. The family was extremely distraught up to that time and still required psychological counseling services. Over a dozen agencies had worked on just that one case. It should also be noted that in this example, the family only required ordinary psychological counseling services. In many of the situations we see, far more extensive services are required for the damage done. There's a case, for example, of an 11-year-old girl who was raped in her bedroom by a stranger that I'm currently handling. He broke in one morning and raped her as she slept, and her parents slept upstairs. That girl afterwards suffered such severe depression that she was suicidal. She had self-destructive thoughts. They persisted for years afterwards. She remained under intensive psychological counseling. Her depression only began to show some signs of easing, and her self-destructive behavior, she's a cutter and a bulimic, only began to ease when her rapist was caught, again through DNA based on a petit larceny conviction that he had in a neighboring county. The long-term costs, though, can be even more extreme, particularly from a psychological perspective. Take, for instance, the case of a 9-year-old girl I'll call Rachel. She lived with her grandmother. along with her mom and her siblings. Her grandmother's boyfriend